think any university student could be swayed to be that person. Any university student that I know. They could be swayed to start a revolution, as in they could be like, become a person, like become a hippie, become someone who's trying to, you know, save the world by recycling, you know, but every small thing, I think that they could easily become that person that does want to change the world and is a little bit, you know, one with the trees or whatever, you know.
There is some signs of it lately that, you know, that the youth are starting to get involved, and they are at last starting to have a voice.
I always find it really insulting when people of my age, and I'm 53, look back to the 60s and say, oh, everybody then was so passionate, so revolutionary. Young people today are so apathetic. That's an entirely false comparison, I think. People today are just as passionate as the people in the 60s and 70s were. It's just being expressed in a different way.
An emerging thought line from the youth that they're all pissed off because most of them haven't got jobs, and they can't get a job, and they've got no money, and they've got all their friends haven't got jobs.
Like, to be honest, outside England, I'd never know what's going on, really, unless it's, you know, big things that are on the news, but like small things, like I'm sure a lot of people don't know about, but then if we're told, I definitely think that people today do care.
I think if you read the history books of the 60s and 70s, you get the impression that every young person between 18 and 25 was on the streets every day protesting about stuff, and actually it was a really tiny minority of people. Even amongst students, it would tend to be the humanities students, and only a very small proportion of them who were out on the streets. The rest of them just went to university every day like most students do. And so when people make that comparison between then and now, and they say, oh, only a tiny proportion of students now are doing anything, well, I think it was the same in the 60s.
But with teenagers today, there's so much going on, there's so many things, there's so many influences, the TV, the internet, communication and things like that. There's so much open to them, whereas before it'd be a small group of people that had the same mindset, you know, and you had to track those people down. And once you got talking to one person, you'll find other people, and then other people, and other people, and then there was a group of you that were all into the same sort of thing, and you weren't alone.
What brought people together in the late 60s, young people, was a sense of solidarity and a sense that they were different from what had gone before. Because they were growing up in more affluent times, they had a sense of freedom about their future. They felt that they could actually do things that were beyond anything their parents could have imagined. And in political terms, they grew up being very suspicious about the consumerist culture that had grown up. For their parents, they'd grown up during the war, and it was very much a question of just survival. By the time you got to the late 60s, you had a generation who thought, well, there must be more to life than this. There must be more spiritually, politically, and socially as well. And so they very much wanted to overturn the old order. They felt that in order to reach a more fulfilling kind of life, that they had to actually do something actively and eventually in terms of violence almost to overthrow that old order.
An emerging thought line.
Save the world.
I think the interesting thing about the student demonstrations and the protests of the late 60s is that by and large those students were middle class, because they were the ones who grew up with a sense of economic freedom, and there was a real kind of solidarity between working class political movements and the middle class students, where I think some of the political theorists at the time tried to sort of co-opt the students into being part of a sort of worldwide Marxist working class movement. But that was always a really uneasy coalition, because at the end of it, there was always the feeling that the students, after they played at being revolutionaries, were going to end up going off into nice middle-class careers, which is what happened. Whereas the trade unions, the working-class revolutionaries, were still going to have to fend for themselves.
To be honest, people have got it, like especially in England, quite easy, like women and men. I know there are still like differences, you know, in kind of things that directly affect us, but generally, everyone's got it pretty good. It's not like the women can't vote, and it's not like the women can't go to school, college, university, or anything like that. There are jobs. I know that it's recession.
I'm too old to be part of that generation, sadly, but I wonder for a lot of young people today whether they feel that in some way the society they live in is so complicated that it's impossible for them to have any say in how it's operated. It all seems to be, all the big decisions are being made by corporations or organisations that are just so far removed from their everyday lives.
I don't want to categorise or anything, but I think you get certain people that are still trying to make a difference, whether they're doing it because it impresses their friends, or whether they're kind of that kind of group where they think, oh, woe is me, the world's a bit rubbish. I think there's definitely groups that would sit up and listen and be different and individual about it and just go.
For me, the really heartening thing about the protest recently has been that young people have been getting back onto the streets and realising that they aren't alone. That's always the big first step, is not just thinking, I don't agree with what's going on, I hate it, but to actually find out that other people around you of your age feel the same way you do, and then you can feel that power of the mass movement starting to grow.
Didn't think one more person would have made much of a difference, I suppose.
I didn't go to the student protest in London because I'm not allowed to say I couldn't be bothered. I don't know. Yeah, I couldn't be bothered. It was in London, I'm in Brighton.
So it's not that I don't care about it, because I really do, and I really think it's something that I'm glad people are making a fuss over it finally, but I don't know, just didn't really have the time.
I didn't go to the student protest in London because I genuinely think that it probably won't make a difference. Better things to do with my time than go to London and protest.
Other than that, I haven't seen a student protest ever myself.
Because I know a lot of people that live in London, live right near it, that didn't go, just because one, they either hadn't really paid attention to what day it was on, or just couldn't be bothered to get out of bed because it was quite early, especially the start. But then, yeah, I guess like a few people probably, were there just because it was, mob mentality, and the whole crowd was going, their friends were going, and that might be the only reason they went.
I think young people now have more pressure than they've ever had before, in terms of going to university, starting jobs. It's a very unstable market. Students have so much responsibility now, young people in general, that sometimes the current affairs on the news, if it doesn't relate directly to their day-to-day life, they're not maybe interested, or they don't see its relevance until it's immediate and affects their day-to-day stuff.
Save the world. Save the world. Save the world. Save the world.
We, at King's anyway, we got absolutely bombarded by the student union about the cuts. Like almost every day we were getting event invitations, we were getting messages, things were being posted on people's walls, statuses. So just with that alone, so many people would have heard about it.
An emerging thought line. An emerging thought line.
Principles of journalism haven't changed one little bit from the 60s to now. The means of covering the stories is what has changed. The advances in the technology, the reduction in the size of the equipment, the number of people needed to move it, all those go together to make it much easier. When I was working in the 60s for the BBC, our opposition was ITN, and we both had an evening news to go for. Earlier bulletins during the day, and that was it.
It was like over the news, I think it mentioned that there was going to be protests and stuff, like it was up everywhere, like people were getting their friends to like the reason I went was from a Facebook group event that my friend created, so then there's text from that being like, make sure you all come. Like I think that must have got over half the people there. It would be due to technology.
It's impossible unless you deliberately choose to avoid finding out what's going on, absolutely impossible not to know what's happening.
An emerging thought line.
Save the world.
Look what's happening again now. I think they're brainwashed into, I don't know if that's the right word, brainwashed, but no, they are brainwashed by the Simon Cowells of this world and the X Factors and everything they're made to watch.
So I suppose in terms of heroes, there were two levels. There were people like the rock stars and the student leaders who young people could think, well, they're pretty much like us. And then there were the mavericks, the university professors who weren't old and staid and wearing tweed jackets, but were actually extremely radical, or the poets who seemed to believe in the same things that the young people believed in.
People that I know, role models are celebrities, actresses, singers that don't necessarily stand for one thing. Like, maybe they don't really stand for anything solid at all, which is kind of more celebrity culture. The role model is to become like powerful and famous.
I think I'm always slightly suspicious of the idea of young people and role models, because it's almost patronising. I think young people can become their own role models. The one thing that the protesters learned in the 60s was that if you have a role model, whether it's a rock star or a revolutionary leader, at some point they're going to let you down. Whereas if you believe in yourselves, then it's up to you whether you let yourself down or not.
Like, to be honest, I don't know anyone who's got a politician as a role model, or any, like, you know, a great leader.
We're all fighting for a better life, one way or the other. I mean, look at the students just recently. Fine, fair play to them, but they're not going to get what they want because the establishment is too strong. You know, when we were young, we didn't have televisions in every room. We didn't have computers. We didn't have this and the other. We were lucky to have a whole black and white television in the house, and we were fighting to keep warm with the heating on and things like that. So that we definitely did want more. We wanted more. I think the youth of today, they're more pampered, and it's more of a sort of a right of life to be, in some cases, more arrogant or want more because you've got more.
Look what's happening again now.
I definitely think that mob culture and stuff could have a positive effect if it was kind of went that way, but I think it's a lot easier to go to the violent side. Just to have everyone just sit down and bring London to a standstill, but not violence, just everyone to sit down, that would have had such a positive impact. And I think that it would just be like, look, these students just want to go, they just want to learn.
As far as public reaction was concerned, the majority of the British public, I think, don't like to see riots, demonstrations really, rather than riots. Certainly don't like them at all when they turn into riots. But I think if they have sympathy with what's being protested over, as in the case of tuition fees, but that sympathy was very quickly lost when the buildings were being wrecked and amounted to savagery in some cases, and that's not the best way to win public support.
Really, the student demonstrations in the late 60s were the first time that their elders had actually seen young people en masse on the streets, and I think they felt very, very threatened, particularly because the students were being so vocal in their opposition to the culture that the police represented. So very, very quickly, regardless of how violent the students were being, and often they weren't being violent at all, just the fact that they were there en masse persuaded the police and the people who were in charge of the police that this was a really dangerous, subversive thing that was growing up, and it needed to be squashed immediately. And of course, the more violent the forces of law and order are, the more violent students are, and the more students come out on the streets. So it was actually self-defeating.
Look around, you guys! Look at the police on the street and the helicopters in the sky. They're watching us. They're looking at us. We are making a difference.
The issues were mostly at that stage anyway, the political ones. Now, I think among the students there's perhaps more concern over social issues than the great political issues, and certainly, and I don't mean that this is necessarily selfish, but certainly over the tuition fees, they were protesting on their own behalves, or on behalf of their parents and so on. They weren't looking at it in the context of the general economic situation and the desperate need that there was. So maybe I think that a political worldwide view of issues taken by students these days, and a bit more concentration on issues that affect them, the students themselves.
That issues aren't necessarily as important to most people as they used to be. So I think it would definitely be completely split if someone was trying to say, let's change the world. I think a lot of people are happy with it, to be honest. So I think a lot just wouldn't care and just be like, no, I can't be bothered, because to be honest, I'm not that annoyed with it.
I think if there's one thing that the student movement of the 60s and 70s teaches you, it's that students can't cause a revolution by themselves.
If you look back in history to the 1964s and maybe the 1981, the country wasn't maybe in the same depths of depression we are now, but it wasn't in a good place, and there was a lot of arguments, a lot of protests from the punk scene, which all came from the country being in a mess, and look what's happening again now. An emerging thought line. Save the world. Look what's happening again now.